My name is Stephanie Kaufman, and I am the OER lead at Clovis Community College. Also a biology faculty member. That's my main job, but I really fell in love with OER when I got introduced to it as an adjunct, and it's changed the way that I teach. So I'm really excited about sharing that with as many other faculty members as I can. So in this talk today, we're going to go over what those 5 R's of OER are. We're also going to talk a little bit about copyright, public domain, and fair use, which is very, very interesting. And it's interesting how these things have sort of adapted or not adapted to this new world we have where all this information is out on the internet. And then we'll learn about CC licenses, which are the most common licenses for OERs. And then I have several other topics that, we can get to if we have time. You guys can stop me and ask questions, but we can talk about adapting and remixing OERs. It's a little bit more advanced, and also with curating OERs. But we'll definitely talk about attributions and how to attribute different open educational resources. All right, so just to be starting off at the basics, and this was one of the questions in the poll, the 5 R's of OER. So just defining what OERs are, these are materials for teaching and learning that have an open license on them. And that's going to be all we're talking about today is what does that actually mean? What is an open license? And this can be the public domain, which more people are familiar with, but there's also open licenses that aren't as open as putting something in the public domain. And that's what most OERs use. So we'll learn about those. And just because OER materials, they are usually free and they are usually digital, but that's not what defines them. So not everything that is free on the internet is an OER. And also not everything that is OER is necessarily free. Sometimes there can be a cost associated with that, though it's usually a much, much lower cost than a copyrighted material. So we usually think about OERs as having these 5 R's, and it's sort of the main criteria when we're looking at an online textbook or we're looking at online resources to use in our class. If they're truly OER, then they'll have these 5 things. The first is that you'll be able to reuse the content. So you can put it in your slides, right? I'm looking at a textbook on an open textbook. I can then take figures from that and put them in my slides. Or just reuse it. I can also retain it, which means like now that I've downloaded that textbook, it's mine, right? I can have it forever. You can revise it, meaning you can actually make a copy of it and edit the content. So these are big differences from a traditional copyright. You can remix it, which means you can take multiple OERs or materials with open licenses and sort of put them together into a new thing to create something original. And you can redistribute it. So you can make copies of it and give them to your students, give them to other people. So these are our 5 R's: reuse, retain, revise, remix, and redistribute. And we'll come back to them when we talk about the Creative Commons licenses. Do you guys have any questions? My dog is being very needy right now for some reason. Right. Okay, before we go into the licenses, I do just want to kind of go over some of the benefits of having an OER textbook or just using OER materials in your class in general. There is a lot of money getting put into ZTC and OER work right now. And the main driving for that is honestly because it saves students a lot of money, not a little bit of money, but a lot of money. And so that's one of the biggest driving factors, right? That is a barrier for our students to get through college, is how much textbooks can cost. But it's not the only benefit. And there's a lot of benefits to the instructor also. But one of them is just access. So when you use OER, all of your students have access to the materials on the first day. And also student success. There are plenty of studies out there that show that students are less likely to drop an OER course, presumably because we do have students that drop courses because they can't afford the textbook. And we've done polls both in our district and at our individual colleges. And at Clovis, for example, more than half of our students have not taken a full load of classes in a semester when they wanted to, only because they couldn't afford all the textbooks for those classes. And it's similar across all 4 of our colleges. OERs are also really adaptable. You can edit them so that they better reflect our students and reflect our community. You can be very creative with them because of this. And we're going to talk about this if we have time at the end, being able to adapt and remix them. And also OER textbooks can actually be much more up to date because there's no publishing cycle where you have to wait 3-5 years for the next edition. The OER textbook I use, they update it every semester. So sometimes, and that can also include errors. So when you find errors in a publisher's textbook, you can report it, but when will that get incorporated? When you use something like OpenStax, and if you do find an error or they add new content, that happens on a semester by semester basis. They update it each semester, which is really nice. Do you guys have any questions or thoughts? All right, so let's get into the licensing. And it's the licensing is kind of straightforward, but it does require that you have a little bit of an idea of what copyright actually is. Like what is just that? Like we use that word all the time. So I want you guys to think about this scenario. An English professor is creating brand new material, a brand new and original essay prompt for their course. At what point would they own the copyright to this work? So A, as soon as they write or type it out. B, as soon as they send it out to their students for the first time. C, when they file for a copyright. Or D, never. An essay prompt isn't something you can copyright. So what do you guys think? You can think about it for a second. If you want to type in the chat which letter you think is correct, or you can unmute yourself. Either one is good. So we've got as soon as they write or type it out, as soon as they send it to their students, when they file, or never. What do you guys think? And so it's so nice to enjoy like warm tea now that it's not really hot outside. All right, so we've got a couple that are choosing D. And I think that that is what most people think in this case. Yeah. A lot of, if we just went out and asked people, most people would say that like you have to maybe apply for a copyright, or something like an essay prompt isn't something that you can copyright, but it actually is. So the correct answer in the United States is actually A. As soon as you create this work, copyright is automatic in the US. So you don't have to file for it. So we don't even realize that, right? Like we create all this stuff for our classes. I've made so many worksheets and things. And so the moment you make them, they're your creative works and they are copyrighted to you, right? Unless you're doing it for a company or something, then maybe they own the copyright. But if you as an instructor are just creating things, then that copyright is automatically yours and it belongs to you. That also means that since this work is copyrighted, that technically people have to ask you to use it. And that's not really how we work in education, right? Like we share, a lot of us share our stuff that we create for our courses. And when we onboard new people, we kind of have these huge folders or Canvas courses that are full of things that people have made, and you can just use them, right? But really those works are copyrighted. And so what Creative Commons licenses try to do is kind of navigate this space, because a traditional copyright, which is what all of our works automatically contain, they only allow for reuse if you actually ask permission, right? So same thing is true for an online website that is copyrighted, right? If you wanted to reuse it, you can send your students there, of course, but if you were going to take content out of it and wanted to do something with that content, you have to ask them for permission. So if you wanted to put their images in a book or something like that, that's copyrighted and you'd have to ask for permission. So when something's copyrighted, it means that all the rights belong to the person who holds that copyright. So the instructor who wrote that essay prompt technically holds all the rights to that essay prompt. So when we think about our 4 Rs or our 5 Rs for OER, copyrighted works, you only get the top one. Like if you buy a book, you get to keep it. It's yours. It's you own that book now. So you still get to retain it, but the other 4 Rs you don't get with copyrighted work. And so what open licenses try to do is open licenses acknowledge that that work is yours and that copyright belongs to you, but maybe you as the author want to give some of those rights to the user, right? So these are called open licenses. So open licenses release some or all, but it's usually some of the rights that are protected by copy law. And the author is to choose which ones they want to let go of, right? So over here on the far side, we have all rights reserved. That's a traditional copyright. On the far opposite spectrum, you have the public domain, which a lot of people have heard of the public domain. Things that are in the public domain, the creator no longer has any rights to them. So these open licenses are in the middle. The open licenses, the Creative Commons licenses that we're going to talk about, author relinquishes some of their rights, but holds on to some of them as well. So it's some rights reserved. So got all rights reserved as copyright, no rights reserved as public domain. And we're looking for something sort of in the middle that would give people more freedom to use the materials in their classes, but also still protect the person who made it and still give that person who created that their credit for all their time and their work to create it. You guys have any questions so far? All right, so we'll kind of start on the other side. We'll start with the public domain. Have you guys heard of the public domain before? This one's usually talked about a little bit more just in general conversation, but public domain work is not protected by copyright. So if there is public domain work that fits within your discipline, you are free to use it as much as you want within your classes, right? Within any works, okay? And there's a couple different ways that things end up in the public domain. Some authors intentionally put their things in the public domain, but also things can fall into the public domain. So I'll give you guys some examples of different, there's 4 ways that works end up in the public domain. First one is that the copyright has expired. So the laws have changed over the years, but in the United States, copyrights usually expire 70 years after the death of the author. It used to be 50 years, and there are some different laws that have come up more recently. But usually, if that time has passed and the copyright expires, then that work will fall into the public domain. And that's why a lot of older, even novels, right, like Jane Austen's novels, those are all in the public domain because they expired. Those ones probably 50 years after the death of the author. Also, you can have copyright owners that don't follow the copyright renewal rules, and then they will fall into the public domain. Case 3, sometimes people put them in the public domain on purpose. They create something and they choose to put it in the public domain. And then the 4th one, which I find use a lot in science, is that copyright law actually doesn't protect all types of work in the United States. And a really, really good example is government-funded work. Government-funded work is not eligible for copyright, so it is automatically put into the public domain. So things that are out there on like the Center for Disease Control website, if they create figures, the data that they put out there, the pamphlets that they put out there, all of those materials are actually automatically in the public domain just simply because they're not allowed to, they don't qualify for copyright because they're made by the government. So, for example, in my classes, since I teach biology, this is an image here of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. This is from the NIH. And because the NIH is the one that this is an electron micrograph, because they're the one that took it and they put it out there, it is a public domain image right away, just because it can't hold any kind of copyright. So this isn't even an old image, right? It's actually very new and recent, but it is in the public domain just because it comes from the government. So if your particular fields have some sort of government agency associated with them, that is often a good place to go and look for some public domain. One thing with public domain images, though, is that they actually don't require any sort of credit, right? So I put the credit down here for who took this picture, and I linked to the picture, but that's actually not legally required when you're using a public domain image or public domain writing, whatever it might be, literature. But it is best practice to add one. And the reason for that is just transparency. If I'm giving these slides out to people, they'll see this electron micrograph and, whose is it? Did I take that? It's in my slides. Where did I get it from? So just adding that source adds that level of transparency. So anybody who's looking at these materials, these OERs later, they know where you got that from and they could use it themselves if they want to, right? Because otherwise, if somebody's looking at this and they want to use that image, they might cite me because these are my slides, right? But I didn't take this, and that's not the proper citation, right? It would be to the NIH. Do you guys have any questions about the public domain? I've also had some art instructors have luck finding some public domain stuff, images. All right. So the next one, and this is one that educators use quite a bit, and we absolutely are legally allowed to. And this is called fair use. So fair use is not a license. It's what we call an exception to copyright. And public domain is kind of an exception to copyright too, in a way. But fair use just allows that copyrighted work should be allowed to be reused and reproduced in minimal ways that promote discourse. And the reason that this fair use exists is to allow for open discussions about copyrighted work. Because you can imagine a world where if somebody published something and then you were never allowed to reference them or quote them or, put little pieces of their work in a critique of them, for example, then we would kind of be shutting down this kind of open discourse and we wouldn't be able to have it so much because I wouldn't be able to quote and say like, hey, this news article said this, and I think that's wrong because, or I think that this is a good idea because, right? So that's kind of where the idea of fair use comes from, so that people can discuss copyrighted works without fear of copyright infringement. But that being said, the fair use is a little bit ambiguous, and I think they made it ambiguous on purpose, but that's okay. Educators do have more leniency for fair use, meaning it's more likely okay for us to use a little piece of something copyrighted than for others, because there are 4 things that are considered. So those are these 4 bullet points here. It's the purpose or character of the use. So if it's for educational purposes, it's probably more okay that you use a figure, like say you find a copyrighted image and you want to use it in your slides for your class. If you're using it for educational purposes, it's honestly probably fine, right? But where you would run into issues is if you took that copyrighted image and you put it in a book and you were selling that book, right? Then you're probably infringing on that that person's copyright, right? So that's one thing. The other is the nature of the copyrighted work. So what its intent is and what the intent is of the thing that you're making is the amount of it that you use, right? So it's probably never okay to photocopy an entire book for a discussion. But if you were photocopying for your class one page to discuss a paragraph or something like that, then that's maybe okay, right? It also depends on like what that copyrighted work is. Photocopying a textbook from Pearson and McGraw-Hill, that's kind of the nature of the copyrighted work. They would probably argue you can't do that unless you're using their textbook in your class, right? Whereas if it's a novel and you're taking a little excerpt so your class can discuss it, it might be different. And then the effect of the market on the copyrighted work. So is you using this work going to lose the person who made it money, right? If it is, you probably are going to be, it's not going to pass the fair use test and you're probably infringing on their copyright, right? So those are the four kind of things. But you can definitely use some copyrighted stuff in your slides and in your class under this fair use exception. So I wouldn't be, don't be scared about it. You can always ask somebody if you aren't sure. But a good example, if you have a copyrighted journal article, and you want to have your students discuss a figure from it, you can put the figure in your slides. Just make sure that you cite the source, all right? And if you link to the source, that's even better, because this is going to fall under fair use, right? You're using it for education. It's not going to be a problem. If you're using it for something else, if you were trying to make money off of it, it would be a difference. So I can give you guys these slides, but I have a link here for some best practices for fair use. So there is a little bit of leeway to use some copyrighted materials in OERs, but not a lot. You want to stick to open things as much as you can. Do you guys have any questions about fair use? I know it can be kind of a tricky concept, especially because there's no rules. I get asked a lot like, well, what is the percentage? Like, how much of this can I use before it's not fair use anymore? And there isn't an answer to that. You guys use fair use at all in your classes? All right.
Is that just for fair use? Is that just if you copy something out of a textbook, like one page or something?
So if it's like a Pearson or McGraw-Hill textbook, it might not. You can we could look at your specific example, but it might not even count as fair use then, because unless you're using that textbook in your class, right? Because I think if we look at our 4 tests, if you're copying things from a textbook that you aren't using in your class, that you aren't requiring your students to get for the class, then I think it violates number 4, right? Because if we're using Pearson or McGraw-Hill figures in our materials, but we're not using their books, then we are actually denting their profits, which is maybe part of the point of OER, is to dent their profits, but we want to do it legally.
I do have a question, because what if they can find parts of the book on the internet?
Well, that depends on how they're finding it. If it's out there for free, like you can use copyrighted things with all of your OERs that are online for free. So a lot of Khan Academy's articles, for example, are copyrighted. It's absolutely fine to send your students to Khan Academy to have them read things, have them do practice problems there, right? Even though that is copyrighted there, because Khan Academy is putting it out there for free on the internet. So there's a lot of websites like that are educational websites that are copyrighted, but they're free to access, free to use. It's not even fair use. It's free. Like YouTube is a good example too. So it's not even an example of fair use. They can use those. But if we're talking about books that are illegally put on the internet, or parts of the textbook that are illegally put out there, then that would not count as fair use. But if there are parts of it Like for example, I've had my students the excerpt for I Contain Multitudes, which is a book about the microbiome. There's an excerpt of it that is freely available online, right? And it's not copyright infringement. The author has that excerpt out there. Um, Having them read that or directing them to that is absolutely fine, right? But if I tried to give them the whole book, which is copyrighted, or a part or an excerpt, a big piece of the book that wasn't being put out there for free, it wouldn't count. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, and I know some students, I mean, I've gone to student panels where students have admitted that when a book is really expensive, when a textbook is really expensive, that they will go get a pirated version of the book. We cannot condone that, but that is something that students do because textbooks are really that expensive, right? And they can't afford it. So their option is that or not have the textbook for the class. And they're going to choose to go get that downloaded copy. Any other questions about fair use? All right, so let's talk about the Creative Commons licenses. So most OERs have a Creative Commons license, but it's not the only kind of open license that exists. What these do is they take that all rights reserved copyright that you have as the creator, and they change it to a some rights reserved. And that's you as the creator or whoever wrote the textbook that you're maybe going to adopt is the one who makes this decision. So this allows creators to keep their copyright, but also allows them to give some of the permissions to others so that they don't have to ask for permission first, right? So if I put a regular copyright, then technically people would have to ask me, can I use this in my class? Can I edit it in my class? Can I change it for my class? But with the Creative Commons license, you can be really transparent up front and say, like, this is mine. I made it. You should attribute me. But if you want to use it in your class, I don't care. Like, you don't have to ask me. You can use this in your class. So that's what it allows to happen. One of the most important things about Creative Commons is that all of the licenses require that the creators get credit for the work that they did. So you can't use them without attributing back to the creator. They are just a built-on copyright. So they're not separate licenses from copyright. They just sort of modify that copyright that already exists. So everything that's already protected in copyright still exists for your work. You're just giving up some of your rights. So if you guys have seen any Creative Commons licenses, they have these symbols. So we'll talk about what those symbols means. So there's a question, what happens when there's a discrepancy in the textbook you're using? Do you contact the author? And yes, that's what I would do. I have several times reported errors that I've found in OpenStax textbooks. And at least for OpenStax, they will update it, right? The other thing too, depending on what the OER is you might actually be able to edit it, right? I can't edit OpenStax, but you might be able to edit the version that you're using to fix it for your students. So I actually I'm working on remixing a book right now, and I found an error. They used the wrong term for the nucleotides in the DNA. And in the version I gave my students, I've already fixed that error. But I also reported it to OpenStax so that they can fix it and they'll have it fixed by spring. So what are all these icons? Yeah. So these icons, as you start looking at OERs, you will start seeing more of these. And the way that they have these visual representations of the different licenses and their elements. And we'll go through each one of these, but there's an attribution element, which all of them have, a share alike, a non-commercial, and a no derivative. And so what's nice about these is you as the author get to sort of pick which ones you think fit your work, right? So that you are not giving up more than you want to give up of your rights for this work. So we can look at all of them. In total, there are 6 Creative Commons licenses. And there are 4 elements that make up those licenses. So the first element is the by, and this is the attribution element. All of the Creative Commons licenses have an attribution element because it's a fundamental sort of tenet of these open licenses and the open movement that the creator always get the credit for what they have done or what work they have put into this. So all of the licenses have a by element on them. You can choose to add a share alike element as well. So this is the SA element. A share alike element says you can use this, you can do the 5 R's with this work, but whatever adaptations or downstream products you create or deliver, like content for your classes that you create, those content must have the same license that my work has. So you're putting a restriction on what license the future works have. The other one, the next one is the NC or the non-commercial. And this one is actually pretty common for educators to put because Creative Commons are not limited to education. This is a license that anyone in any field could use. But the non-commercial allows for only non-commercial use by others. So you as the creator could profit and make money off of your OER that you create if you wanted to, but this license would say that anybody using it downstream of you would not be able to unless they ask for your permission. So this is a common one for educators to put on theirs. It does limit a little bit of the use that might happen with it afterwards, but it does mean that other companies or even the publishers wouldn't be able to use it because publishing companies like McGraw-Hill and Pearson, they do actually take OERs and sell them within their platforms.
Ecosystem.
Yeah. And then the last one is the no derivatives. So the no derivative element says that you can use this, but you cannot edit it or change it or remix it. You have to use it in the form that I, the creator, or you, the creator, made it, right? So no derivative elements do make it so that that content does not follow the 5 R's. So no derivatives are not generally considered to be open educational resources because you can't remix and you can't do some of those other of the 5 R's. So it's not technically an OER, but that does not mean you can't use no derivatives in your classes. I've found lab protocols that were no derivative that I've used in my classes before because it's still free. It's still free for the students to use. It's just not truly an OER because you aren't able to remix it. I couldn't edit it to fit my class better. You guys have any questions so far? And these are the symbols too that go with them. Okay, so from these 4 elements, there are 6 licenses that you can add to your work. And you can just add these, like you don't have to do anything other than write an attribution at the bottom that says this work is by me and I'm sharing it under a CC by SA license and link to the license. So adding these to your work is as easy as that. But these are the 6 licenses. The first one is CC by. This one means you can do anything with this work, but you have to always attribute it back to the creator, right? So you can remix it, you can change it, you can edit it, you can put it together with other OERs. You just have to attribute back. The second one is CC by SA, which means you can do all of those things, but whatever you create with it must keep the CC by SA license. You can't change the license of the work. The next one is CC by NC. So you can do anything as long as it's not commercial, as long as you're not making a profit from it. And then we have some that have kind of more elements. You have CC by NCSA, which means You have to attribute, you can't make money off of it, and anything that comes from it must keep that same CC BY NCSA. And then the next two both have that non-derivative on them, which means that they're not, you can't edit them or you can't reuse them. So CC BY ND just means, you can use this, but you can't change it or alter it in any way. So one of the places, sometimes people are like, well, why would you want to do this one if you're, if you want people to be able to use this widely? I think one of the times where I've seen people use this ND derivative is, for example, if you're making like a scientific figure with data, you might not want people, like it's a data figure, right? People shouldn't need to edit that or change it because the data is what the data is. And you don't want people making figures from yours that misrepresent the scientific evidence. And then the last one is CC BY NCND, which just means no derivative, but also you can't use it for commercial. So that's a lot of information. So I want to give you guys a couple minutes to like digest some of that. And thinking of these 6 licenses, which one of these would be the most open license? So to you, like if you were finding OERs that had these different elements on them and you were going to use them in their class, which one would let you do the most with it? And the opposite, which one of these would be the most restrictive, would have the least options for you to use them in different ways in your courses? And you guys can type it in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Which one would be like the most open and which one would be the least open? We've got a couple answers in the chat. So CC BY SA for the most open, CC BY for the most open, the least open, maybe CC BY NCND. So for the least open, it is going to be this last one. I think it's going to have the least uses, right? Or the least potential downstream applications, because you can't alter it, you can't adapt it. And then you're also restricting, which doesn't matter much to us because we are in education, but just in the global bigger scheme of things, you would only be able to use this for non-commercial reasons. So I like that you guys are getting different answers for the most open, because that one is a little bit trickier. And I will be honest with you, when I started in OER, I added the CC BY SA license to all the things that I made because in my mind, I thought this is the most open because whatever happens after those things stay in the Creative Commons. But as I started making more OERs and I started using lots of other people's, it actually does add a restriction. So it does create some areas where you now can't use those. So the most open one is actually the CC BY license because it doesn't add any sort of restriction. It does allow for things to not be relicensed within the Creative Commons, but that's still allowing for it to be used in more ways than the CC BY SA one. And picking a license for your OERs is entirely up to you as the creator and what you're comfortable with. But over the years, as I've made more and more, I have taken off more and more of the elements. Today, like everything I make just has a CC BY on it. And that's what I'm comfortable with. It's not what everybody's comfortable with. A lot of people favor either the CC BY SA or the CC BY NC or the one with both of those, right? So that the work has to stay with that same license. Do you guys have any questions about these 6? Ready for a quiz? It's not really a quiz. I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions. It's a little quiz, right? But most open to least open, this is how these fall. Obviously, this wasn't an option on the previous one, but the very most open one is, of course, the public domain, because you can do anything with those. Then CC BY, and then so on. All right. I just want to reiterate again that all of these, if you're using them to create things, require that you attribute back to the creator of those works. And I'll show you a good format for attributions. And you don't necessarily, if you're linking to OpenStax, that's a little different. But if you're going to create, like take some stuff from OpenStax and put it in your Canvas, then you want to attribute it and say where you got it from and who did that work.
Yeah.
All right, so let's think about, did you have a question? Sorry. Okay, so let's think about this scenario. If something has a CC BY SA license, which of the following would you not be able to do with it? So I have a little cheat sheet over here so you can reference them. Which one would you not be able to do with it? Sell it, attribute the original author, modify it, or give it to your students with the CC BY license on it? So you can think about this one. You can unmute yourself if you think you might know, or you can type it in the chat. Which one would you not be able to do? So we have a couple answers, C, D, E. So for this one, it is D. You would not be able to give it to your students with the CC BY license on it. It has to always have that CC BY SA license. You technically could sell it. Most people wouldn't because it's an open free resource, but technically you could try. But you do need to attribute the original author, and you are able to modify it and create new derivatives of it. If this is like a lab protocol, you could rewrite, you could change the lab protocol to match your lab and your samples that your students are going to collect. But that new lab with your modifications would still have to have the CC BY SA license on it, even though you've added new elements. All right, let's do one more. So which license would allow us to revise, remix, and redistribute as long as you don't make a profit off it and you don't change the license? So there's a lot in there. So which license would allow you to revise, remix, and redistribute as long as you don't make a profit on it and you don't change the license? So I don't have any option like A, B, C, D here, but there's a little cheat sheet of the 6 licenses we can choose from and what the 4 elements.
Remix and redistribute as long as you don't make a profit. Change the license. CC BY SA.
So CC BY SA.
CC BY and C. CC BY and C.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a couple elements in there, and I'm looking in the chat too. So the don't make a profit off of it tells us what element has to be on there. Our non-commercial. And you can't change the license, so it must have the SA. So it would be the second to last one on this list here, right? The CC BY NC SA would be the one that would match this description. So do you guys have any questions about the licenses? They can seem really tricky, but you get used to them pretty fast. And they are really powerful because they let you do a lot of things that you can't do with traditional textbooks. You can really customize your class. You can create a class that's specific to, your specific learning outcomes, but also to our students and to the things that they might be looking towards in their career, things that are specific to our Central Valley. So I'm sorry to keep going with all the biology examples, but one really common one is being able to change the examples of ecosystems to local ecosystems, right? Either ones that are found in our mountains near us or here in the Central Valley around us, right? It teaches students more to care about our ecosystems. It's really beautiful when the textbook has a picture of a coral reef as the example of an ecosystem, but most of our students have never been to a coral reef, but they have been here, and being able to see the living things that do live here and around our area, it's much more meaningful for our students. So when you use OERs, you can actually directly change your book so that it has those elements in them. All right, do you guys have any questions? We only have 10 minutes, so before we do, we can talk a little bit about remixing, and I'll give you guys these slides, but I do want to show you quickly what an attribution would look like, because I said that, you have to always credit the author. So an attribution is going to look something like title, author, source, and license. So we call this tassel. So if we have this picture here that somebody took, you would have an attribution like this. So the title of it is Creative Commons 10th Birthday Celebration San Francisco. You're linking to where that original work lives. By TiVo was the author here, and then it's licensed CC by 2.0, and then linking to that license if you can, right? So there are several attribution builders that you can use. I should put the link to this one in the chat if you want to check it out. But so you can build your attributions yourself, but you can also, by Enid, you can also use something like this attribution builder where you just type in the name of your things. You can put the link to where you got it from, and it will create the attribution itself. This one over here, I'll show you quickly an example of an attribution or a derivative. So this image represents a derivative. So let's say you found an assignment for your class that was an OER, and then you have edited it, you've adapted it for your class. So that's the analogy here. They took this picture and they've made a derivative of the picture by changing the content, the contrast, I guess. So now this attribution has the original information and the information for this new image, which you or this new person has created, right? So it says this work, which they've renamed 95, is a derivative of, and then it has all that same information for the original image and the license for it. So both of these have slightly different purposes. One, is for the original work. You're using it. You're not changing it in any way, which is really common. But if you are changing it, then you want to have a attribution that says that it's a derivative of that. And you're actually able to, this is your new work. This second image, it's not the same. It's a new work. So this one can have a new title. It's, you're now the creator of it, but you always have to attribute back to the original one. All right. Do you guys have any questions about attributions? All right. So we only have about 7 minutes left, which is not enough time to go over a lot about remixing and adapting work, but that is the powerful piece of open licenses. So I'll share these slides with you in just a second, but what makes OERs more powerful than a copyrighted textbook, and it's not just textbook, right? OERs can be many, many different things. They can be assignments, they can be slides, they can be all sorts of things. But what makes them more powerful is that you can adapt or revise them because the original creator gave you permission to do so when they added that Creative Commons license to their work. So you can adapt them, so just making it a derivative of it, but you can also remix them. So this is kind of neat. You can do this in many forms, but you can take multiple OERs and remix them together to create something new that works better for you and your students. So a common example is professors having liking certain chapters of certain textbooks better than others, right? And if you're using a publisher's textbook, you can't require your student to buy like 3 different textbooks so that they can read the chapters that you like the best. But when you use OER, you can actually, there are tools that let you take chapter 1 from this book and chapter 3 from another book and put them together into a new book, right? And the other thing you can do is rearrange the topics. So my class, one of my classes, I teach in a different order. I teach the topics in a different order than the order in the textbook. And because it's an OER textbook, I could just rearrange the chapters so that previously it would be like, all right, this week we're reading chapter 1, next week we're reading chapter 12. But now, because I can just quickly rearrange them, the whole textbook goes in order of my actual class, right? So that's a really cool thing that you can do with OERs. And sometimes you do both these things, right? So when you remix, you often might end up adapting also, right? But you don't have to do this when using OERs. This is completely optional. It is a really powerful piece of using open educational resources. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. I want to use those 4 minutes for questions, and then I'm also going to grab a link really quick for the slides that I can share with you guys. So do you guys have any questions about the licenses, anything, or just want to share kind of what you're maybe thinking of doing with OERs in your class? And then I have some slides at the end too that have some resources. If you guys have questions about wanting to use OERs or any of the OER ZTC funding, there's some ZTC grants that are due in December. You can talk to your OER lead. So that's Sally Potter if you're from Fresno. You can talk to Amanda Tainter from Reedley or Antoinette Azon from Madera, or if you're from Clovis, you can come and talk to me. We do have new grants that we're able to apply for, but they are due in December. So you can reach out to them if you're thinking about doing some sort of bigger project. Yeah, Rob, our chemistry instructors have done some OER work last year. I don't know that they've rearranged the chapters or anything like that, but yeah, it's pretty powerful to be able to do that. It sounds like a small thing, like what's the harm in students jumping around? And I guess there's no harm, but it's so much more streamlined and simple, and the experience is better if the content that they're looking at goes in the same order, and you can, add little bits that finesse it and make it make sense in the order that you have it. Because there's probably a reason you're choosing to do them in those orders, right? And yeah, it's very, very powerful. All right. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, thank you guys. Thank you for coming, and have a happy Halloween.